Hi everybody, welcome back to Bethenaeum. My name is Ellie Marie, and today we are going to talk about basic story arcs as well as some basic plot scenarios. Alright, let's get right into it because I am determined that this video is not going to be as long as some of my other videos. We are going to get through it and we are going to do a good job. So let's go ahead and take a look at two basic story arcs and how they can help you plot your novel. So the first basic story arc looks like this right here. And as you can see, he's got points from A to G that we will work through really quick. And let's just take a look at them. So you have A. This is going to be your starting point of your story. Everything's pretty normal. Your character is going about normal life, has absolutely no idea what's going to happen to him. And this is going to be your protagonist or your main character, the character that the story centers around. And they're going to be going about, and then there's going to be a little bit of falling action, a little bit of stuff kind of not going the way it should be before you come to B, which is going to be that threshold that your character needs to cross in order to begin their story journey. Now, this threshold in an ideal world is going to be a choice, something that the character chooses to do. It's not going to be something that the character is forced into. It's going to be something that they choose to do. And in an even more ideal world, they won't be able to come back from it, and they know that, but they choose to move forward anyway in order to gain something, to pursue a goal, or to fix something, whatever your plot looks like. So we move into the threshold, and then you see some rising action right here. That's C. So C is the rising action, and if you know anything about stories and plotting, you know that this is like the momentum. This is the forward momentum that your story naturally gets as you tell it. And then right here as D, you'll see just a little bit of a hiccup. Now, usually this is whenever your protagonist or your hero character, your main character, comes up against that very first hurdle that they have to kind of find a way over, and usually they're very discouraged. If you have a mentor character in your story, like we talked about last week or earlier this week, I can't remember when I'm going to be posting that video, but we talked about 7 characters you should consider having in your novel. If you haven't watched that yet, I suggest you head over and check it out. This is the opportune time to add in a mentor character or a confidant character. These are good here because they'll be the ones that will kind of help your character overcome this little dip in their forward momentum. So then after D, after your first hurdle that your character has to get over, you'll see a little bit more rising action before you hit E, which is your primary climax in your story. This is going to be that big scene that all of the story is kind of working towards. That big moment where your protagonist comes up against your antagonist, which is your whatever force is pushing against your main character. Now, normally in stories, an antagonist is another character, but that doesn't always have to be. The Day After Tomorrow, I believe, is the movie with like the storms and stuff. The antagonist in those movies is the storms. So an antagonist doesn't always have to be a character, although it is easiest when it's a character. So this is going to be where your protagonist confronts your antagonist. Now, and if you notice, this slope here for F is a lot steeper than our rising action. And that's because your falling action after your climax here at E needs to happen fast. It needs to be quick. It needs to be short. Your climax should not be in the center of your novel. It should be closer to the end of your novel's timeline, because your falling action needs to be fast and it needs to be very fulfilling. That's not to say that your story has to have a good ending, but the falling action needs to be what is required after whatever climax type you have. And then G is going to be your outro, or your flowing out of the falling action and back into whatever normal life looks like now for your protagonist. So that is basic story arc 1. So basic story arc 2 looks like this, and it's not that much different aside from really having this second hump here. So as you remember, A is going to be normal. B is kind of a smaller version of that first hurdle that they have to get over, which was D, if you remember correctly, on our first one. And so it's B now. So then C is our first set of rising action as well as our first smaller climax. So this story arc is meant for a longer novel, something that's going to have a bit more complex of a plot. And so that's ideal more for like fantasy novels or action adventure novels, novels that tend to be longer in nature. So you'll have your first climax as well as a little bit of falling action. So if you're talking about something that's really well known, we'll use Lord of the Rings. So you have Frodo gets the ring to the inn where they were supposed to meet people, but it doesn't really work, so they have to go to the elves, right? So then this is where they get to the elves. And there's a little bit of normalcy because they're bad. They're like where the elves are, and okay, we're going to have this group and they're going to kind of figure it out, and stuff kind of seems like it's going to work out for your protagonist a little bit. But then, oh no, wait, nobody wants to take the ring. So now your protagonist has to pick up again whatever your adventure and your action and your plot is. They have to pick it up again. And this time your climbing action is going to, there we go. Your climbing action is going to happen this way, if I can point correctly. And then you'll have your second climax. Now, in the case of your second climax, this scene needs to be really big. It needs to be that big scene in a movie that everybody thinks of as the climax. It needs to be very impactful for the characters, and it needs to be very impactful for the plot. And if you fail to make this scene big like that, the readers will feel it and they won't be too thrilled. So then after, you have more falling action, and this falling action here needs to be harder and faster than this falling action. It needs to just really push the rest of the plot through to your second little outro thing here, because this is a little bit of an outro, but then it picks back up. So this here is your final outro. And that really needs to be where all of the loose ends come together, where all of your sub-stories, all of your sub-arcs, all of your emotional arcs come to an end. The only things that would not come to an end here are if you have an overarching story arc that's going over multiple novels in a series. That's the only thing that maybe would not end here. But beyond that, this is where everything needs to be tied up at, is at that I, at the outro. All right, so now we're going to talk about 7 basic plot structures and ideas that you could use to help design your novel's plot. I know 7 seems to be our magical number. I also did 7 tools, 7 characters. It's just kind of ended up being that way, and I've enjoyed it so far, so I feel like it's a theme we're going to stick with. So let's look at our 7 plot ideas. Now, the first plot idea is going to be overcoming the monster, and this is a very basic story idea. Everybody kind of understands this. You can see it in a lot of Greek mythology. You can see it in a lot of like traditional fairy tales where you have your big monster that the hero needs to conquer in order to bring life back to where it should be. And examples for this are going to be like Beowulf or Clash of the Titans if you like movies, or like, well, I mean, Perseus, that's Clash of the Titans. Those kinds of things with like Medusa. The monster, there's the monster that you need to overcome, the dragon that the knight needs to slay. That's your overcome the monster. So the second basic plot idea that you could utilize for your novel is rags to riches. And this one is not always necessarily like we would initially think of it, like The Prince and the Pauper. This could also be considered something like Cinderella. Even though the richest part is really towards the end of the story, it is still considered that kind of plot. So a lot of different things can kind of fall into the rags to riches category, but it is a tried and true plot that is a good one to go with. And if you're feeling extra, adventurous and you want to take on the rags to riches plot, also think that riches doesn't have to mean money, and rags doesn't have to be monetarily poor. It could be that your character is poor in positive attitude and they become rich in gaining friends and learning how to just in general be a better person. So rags to riches doesn't have to be money. It can be something else. But that is our second basic plot. Our third basic plot is going to be the quest. And these are often confused with our fourth one, which is Voyage and Return. Third, which is quest, usually implies that for some reason the hero or your protagonist is not going to return from it. The quest, usually it ends where it ends. There is no going back to the way it was before. There is no returning to life the way it was. And so a good example of the quest would be The Pilgrim's Progress. And if you've never read that book, it is a religious work of fiction, and it talks about a traveler's, the pilgrim, his travel through all these varying stages, and he gets from one place to another. And when he gets to the end mark, he doesn't go back. And so that is the idea of a quest, is that it is a travel from one place to another with an adventure in between, and you don't go back to where you started. And with that, we will segue into our fourth one, which is Voyage and Return, which can be more of the character goes on a journey, but then they come back. They collect something and come back, or they finish something that needs to be done somewhere else and then they return. Peter Rabbit is a good example of this one. And we often don't think of children's stories as being basic plots and things that you can look at for examples, but they really are very good because they practice very simplistic plots. And so when you are building a plot, looking at children's books oftentimes is a good place to start. Peter Rabbit is a journey and return. He starts in the home with his mom and his sisters. He goes out and he has his adventure, and he comes back home at the end different and a much more well-behaved bunny. Let's look at number 5, and number 5 is a comedy. And so a comedy could be in the traditional sense of a comedy, like we think of most Adam Sandler movies are comedies, or they make you laugh and they're kind of goofy. Or you can think of it in the Shakespearean version of a comedy, which is what our example is, which is Much Ado About Nothing. And that is a play, and it's not necessarily a comedy in the way we would consider comedy nowadays, but it was a comedy in the traditional sense in that nobody died. Nobody died, and everybody kind of, except for a couple of characters, lived happily ever after. And there is some comedy like we would think about it interdispersed among the drama, but it is a comedy in that it is not a tragedy in the very basic sense, which leads us into our 6th basic plot that you could consider for your novel, and that is a tragedy. Now, tragedies are pretty much exactly like you would think of everybody dies for the most part, and that is just the nature of a tragedy. But tragedies are very good because oftentimes they have a lesson or a poignant point in them that the readers can glean from the story. And so even though you walk away feeling saddened by the loss of life and loss of characters or loss of whatever there's a loss of in a tragic story, you still pull something from that story. There's still an emotional connection. So a tragedy, if that is your vein, is a very good vein to write because it's not as fulfilled oftentimes as some of these others like the Voyage and Return or the Quest plot lines. And a good example of a tragedy is Madame Bovary. If you haven't read Madame Bovary, I highly suggest it. It is a wonderful work. It's a little dry and a little hard to get through, so if you aren't keen on reading really, really classic literature, you can always read the Sparknotes version. It is an excellent example of a tragedy. So our 7th and final basic plot that you could consider implementing for your novel is the Rebirth, and that is a very simple one. Our example for that is Beauty and the Beast, and that is you have a character who is very much so set in one way. In this case, Beauty and the Beast. It's the Beast. He was a very unruly person who had his way or no other way. He was very, very stubborn, very ungrateful, very ungenerous person, and through the events of the story, he comes out on the other side different and better for it. And you see a lot of that in the Rebirth style stories. And this is a very, very good simple plot if that's kind of what you're looking for, is a Rebirth style, because everybody can kind of connect with it. Everybody kind of human beings kind of all connect with this idea of rebirth and of being better than what we are and of striving to be better than what we currently are. And so Beauty and the Beast is a primary example of a rebirth story because you see that in there and people connect with it very deeply, and it is a good basic plot idea to take for your novel. And that's all I have for you today. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you found something interesting or something that will help you with your novel in the future and with writing and planning your work. And I'd like to take this moment to ask you to subscribe and make sure you ring that little bell so that you get notifications when I upload new videos, which is every Tuesday and Friday. Or you can hit me up over at my blog at Bethenaeum.com, and that is updated every Monday and Thursday. And I look forward to seeing out there and what you create. And as always, I appreciate your time. Thanks for stopping by. Bye.